We're sharing the results of NuVoodoo's first quarter digital media study conducted with 3,298 nationwide respondents between the ages of 14 and 54. And this includes just shy of 1,500 regular podcast listeners who've indicated that they listen at least once a week.
This is the first of our two-part series all about podcasting.
We'll show you how often, for how long, and where podcast listening occurs and how podcasting fares compared to other choices along the audio entertainment spectrum. Then later, we'll reveal the best places to market to listeners and build an audience for your podcast efficiently.
Hang on, Lee Jacobs is back with the data next.
As of December 2021, there were nearly 2.4 million podcast titles and almost 60 million total episodes hosted by Apple Podcasts. The average podcast, however, gets only 27 listeners per episode. For anyone trying to monetize, that's like a tree falling in the woods that nobody hears. But NuVoodoo helps podcasters cut through the jungle with research and marketing. We help find the right listeners and grow the audience fast. Learn more about podcast discovery. Contact Tell Me More at NuVoodoo.com.
We found 1,498 regular podcast listeners among our random universe of almost 3,300 respondents. While that's smaller in percentage terms compared to the weekly audience for radio and digital streaming platforms labeled DSPs here, still nearly half in our total sample are now using podcasts on a weekly basis. Millennials represent the largest weekly audience segment for podcasts at 54%, followed by Gen Z at 45%, and 34% of Gen Xers using podcasts at least weekly. The weekly podcast audience over-indexes in the amount of time spent with many forms of audio entertainment, but especially when it comes to podcasts. Overall, better than 3/4 of weekly podcast listeners listen for an hour or more each week, nearly doubling the same level of podcast listening in the overall sample. Weekly podcast listeners also over-index for time spent with both radio and DSPs.
This gives us a clue about how programmatic audio advertising across the audio entertainment spectrum could actually accelerate podcast discovery when marketing.
More than half of weekly podcast listeners consume podcasts 3 or more days each week, and nearly 2/3 of them are using DSPs at a similar rate. And while just north of 1 in 5 within the weekly podcast audience make it to the 5 or more days per week listening level, about 1/3 of them are using DSPs that frequently.
These results show particularly how attractive programmatic audio could be. Over-allocating ad budget to platforms like Spotify, iHeart, and Pandora can actually accelerate awareness for new podcasts.
The weekly podcast audience's robust horizontal listening across the week is matched by the amount of recalled time spent listening each day. More than half the weekly audience listens to podcasts at least 30 minutes a day, and nearly 1/3 of those listening weekly do so for an hour or more each day. Among weekly podcast listeners, 89% of millennials, 85% of Gen Z, and 81% of Gen X listen to at least 2 different podcasts each week. And better than 4 in 10 millennial and Gen Z weekly podcast consumers spend time with 4 or more podcast titles in a given week. Among the weekly podcast universe, driving, exercise, and work top the list of companion podcast listening activities. Millennials over-index in weekly users who drive, exercise, or work while listening to podcasts. They're nearly 50% more likely than Gen Z podcast listeners to listen while they're behind the wheel, and 45% more likely than Gen X listeners to listen to podcasts while working. Meanwhile, America's last pre-digital age generation, the Gen Xers, are the least inclined to multitask, with 37% of Gen X content to do nothing while listening to podcasts. The weekly podcast audience is car audio tech forward, over-indexing our total sample in both connected and connectable cars. By connectable, we mean hooking up to a device via cord or Bluetooth to listen. Over 1/5 of the weekly podcast listeners have a traditional car audio system, which doesn't make it easy to play podcasts.
So now that you've had a snapshot of podcast listening by generation and have had a look at regular weekly podcast listeners and how they're using podcasts, we turn our attention next to podcast discovery. In our next video, a deep dive to help podcasters generate or boost listening. We'll see you then.
Hitting the like button, cast your yes vote for more free media research from NuVoodoo Media Services.